Welcome to The Future Unleashed from Lincoln College, Oxford. I'm your host, Helen O'Hara, and joining me today is Dr. Jennifer Cassidy, who is a scholar here at the University of Oxford and who lectures on diplomacy and international law, digital diplomacy, and gender and diplomacy. So Jennifer served as a diplomatic attaché to Ireland's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York. She was part of the EU diplomatic service to the Kingdom of Cambodia and of Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs. These experiences encouraged her to undertake her groundbreaking DPhil in digital diplomacy, which she completed here at Lincoln and which was the world's first on that subject. Today we are in the Wesley Room at Lincoln, which is named for John Wesley, the cleric who laid the foundations of the Methodist faith. He was a fellow here at Lincoln in the mid-1700s. This room was refurbished in 1928 by American Methodists to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Wesley's election to fellowship in 1726. It took them a couple of years to sort it all out. This houses the Wesley Collection, a library of more than 1,300 books relating to John Wesley and to the early days of Methodism. In addition, it has numerous busts of Wesley and pictures of the famous theologian. So, welcome back, Jennifer. I believe you went to Wesley College before you came to Lincoln for your school in Dublin, so it must be nice to be back here in these surroundings.
Yes, I did indeed, and actually John Wesley, being a fellow here and linked with Lincoln, is one of the primary reasons I chose it, despite not being Methodist, but I have this very, very strong link with Wesley and John Wesley and his founding of many projects.
Tell me about your career. You've been a diplomat and you now teach diplomats about developments in their craft, but you come from a family of musicians. So what led you to this very different career?
The only thing that I was going to be up until the age of 18, 19 was a violinist. Actually at the school Wesley, where I went to. I was on a music scholarship, as were my siblings, and my nickname in the school was Violin Girl. Many people didn't actually know my name. There wasn't much homework being done, not much study. It was all very, very driven towards music. So had a wonderful career in that, played in Carnegie Hall, Sydney Opera House, toured the world with it, but unfortunately I got a back injury. And so that would have led to a very, very shortening of a career. The question was asked, what on earth am I going to do? And I really, really enjoyed history. I had a wonderful history teacher. And the subject that seemed to go along with this was politics. And so history and politics in Trinity College Dublin is very akin to PPE here. And so I thought, okay, that seems a lovely balance. And it turns out actually it was less of the history I enjoyed at the academic level and very much the politics.
Amazing. So what led you to diplomacy in particular?
So after my undergrad at Trinity College Dublin, I applied for the Global Governance and Diplomacy Masters here at Oxford, knowing nothing about diplomacy, may I add, knowing nothing about global governance. And diplomacy actually was the craft and the subject that I was really, really intrigued with. And particularly the lecturer at the time, who is now actually a professor, the world's first professor in digital diplomacy, Cornelia Biola, who teaches at the university. He was a wonderful mentor during that time. But I left Oxford and I went and I joined Ireland's mission to the UN in New York, which was a wonderful experience, and I was a diplomat then for a number of years. And I found myself thinking, do I make a great diplomat? For a number of reasons, I just couldn't see myself speaking for a foreign ministry for the rest of my life. And actually at the time, Ireland had some very strict laws regarding social issues, which we had not overturned. And I actually did not see that being overturned for the next 20, 30 years. Thankfully they were, but I just couldn't see myself being a mouthpiece for a government. It's an extremely worthy job. This just wasn't for me. So I returned to the department here at Oxford and I said, remember me? I'm very much into doing a PhD, a DPhil here, and I would like to do it on digital diplomacy. And it was actually thanks to my mentor, who then became my supervisor, Cornelia Biola, who said, okay, let's take this on. Digital diplomacy, it's not a field, it doesn't exist, there's no literature on it, but let's try this. And here we are.
So let's kind of define the term. You know, what is the difference between sort of digital diplomacy and traditional diplomacy? What makes it special?
So, of course, in academia, there are thousands of definitions, everyone competing for their one to be, the definition. However, in simple terms, digital diplomacy is the digitalization of diplomatic tools and objectives. It is simply the integration of digital tools and strategies and methods to achieve foreign policy goals and domestic objectives.
So what got you interested in that? Is that something that you had kind of used during your diplomatic career, that you'd sort of become aware that something was fundamentally changing in that sphere?
Well, I certainly didn't use it because it wasn't allowed. So working in the United Nations at the time, Twitter, well, that was growing, but Facebook and Instagram, these were all operating to such heightened levels outside of the General Assembly in New York. Everyone was using them. You just were not allowed to use them in diplomatic forums. There's many more aspects of it, and I just thought to myself, look, there has been so many waves of technology in diplomacy, from the printing press, from the telegraph, to the fax machine, to the phone, to the radio, to even then 24-hour news channels. I was like, there's no way this wave of technology is going to not filter into this hole. And so I thought, look, I'll go to the department and say, this is going to become a thing, and it's very much thanks to my supervisor, who took the chance and said, okay, let's do this. And I said, well, what are we going to do about our literature review for the DPhil? And he was like, well, we just publish and cite ourselves. I was like, genius, love this, totally on board. Now, we did cite many other people. That's not actually how it went. But yeah, it was wonderful just working and developing a field that didn't exist.
So, I mean, in terms of digital diplomacy, I'm guessing that the core, the core things you're trying to do remain the same. So is it just a matter of you're doing it faster, maybe? You're doing it more publicly? Like what sort of changes with the advent of digital diplomacy?
First of all, which I think is something clear to establish, which will run through our whole conversation, there's 3 pillars of diplomacy: communication, representation, and negotiation. And these have been the 3 primary pillars since the beginnings of modern diplomacy. Now, modern diplomacy dates back to the 1500s, so modern, if you will, in the Italian city-states with Machiavelli. So these are the 3 pillars. So we always look at and analyze and dissect, well, how has digital diplomacy changed these pillars? So when beginning the study of digital diplomacy, we were primarily beginning to be focused on communication. Of course, that's the one you are geared toward. What's it doing there? In this instance, of course, it's looking at a much greater reach, of course, worldwide reach, the speed at which you can connect with people all across the globe. Public diplomacy goals, which means public diplomacy is essentially the promotion, the nation branding of your state, the soft power of your state, to portray that to the world. But then you have negotiation, which is coming into a more AI aspect, but for just digital diplomacy, just looking at those kind of key aspects at the moment. Negotiation, we've seen huge changes. Well, look, for example, at COVID-19, our economy, our ability to work would not have been able to exist without technology, Zoom, all these aspects of negotiation. So that ability to connect diplomats with each other on a real-time basis is extremely, extremely important. And then we have the representation side, and that's something that I really am beginning to focus on alongside communication. But representation, of course, relates to embassies within host countries. So you have the sending state going over, and then you have the host countries which welcome them. But when we look at representation, what we're actually seeing now is one key difference is that there's actually beginning to become embassies to Silicon Valley. So These are not consulates. These are not sections of embassies on the West Coast accredited to Silicon Valley and working. We're seeing Denmark was the first Ministries of Foreign Affairs and MFA to do this. And what we're seeing here is the acknowledgement and the key awareness of the power of Silicon Valley, the power of technology, the power of these tech companies that they have in the world for foreign policy making, for narrative construction, and that embassies and ministries of foreign affairs really need to change and evolve with their aspect of representation. And we have not seen an embassy accredited to anything other than a nation state since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So it's changing all aspects, and it's consistently evolving and changing. And that's a very short snippet of what it's doing.
So this goes a lot further than just setting up a Twitter account for your embassy in whatever country.
Yeah,
and this is
exactly
really deep stuff.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that we really try to put across when we are doing a lot of teaching with foreign ministries around the world. I was just in Kosovo a number of days ago, working with their ministries of foreign affairs, Armenia, Sweden, also the UK, and making sure that people know that digital diplomacy is not social media diplomacy. Social media is just getting across your message. It's about the strategic use of digital tools in all their forms in order to project and convey your foreign policy in order to meet and obtain your foreign policy objectives. So it is not just social media, it is much more than this. And so, at a very basic level at the start, let's say when I began the DPhil, I was like, oh, it's just social media. And no, that is not. But we've seen it evolve continuously.
Now, as part of that evolution, if you take a large international body like the United Nations, for example, has it fully adapted to the rise of digital diplomacy? Has it embraced all of these tools and all of these possibilities? Or is it quite a slow process to have some of those organizations kind of shift in this direction?
A complicated question, which it shouldn't be, but it is. But I was about to answer diplomatically, but then I realized I'm not a diplomat anymore, and that's one of the reasons I left. So let's not answer diplomatically. So for the first part of your question, it has adopted it very fast. The minute it came in, every single UN agency, UNDP, UNHCR, UN Women, everyone was opening a Twitter account, X, opening all these social media accounts, but they were very much, to link to our last discussion, very much in the mindset that it was just digital diplomacy was simply social media diplomacy. But with that said, they did take up the mantle, and most agencies and most parties and most leaders within the UN under Secretary Generals, the Secretary General, all have social media accounts, and also within the UN agencies as a whole. They are thankfully developing more away from this just projection of their message to strategy and tactic in order to really project and, as I said, achieve their foreign policy goals. Now, on the other hand is, well, how successful have they been on it? Diplomats are diplomats. They do not speak for themselves. They speak for their foreign ministry. Even these UN agencies who are, appointed, the leaders are appointed, they still speak for their agencies. They still have to engage in diplomacy. They cannot send out anything that is in any way going to, ignite a war. Who wants that? Ignite a war or ignite, issues between diplomatic relations. But we do have to respect to some degree that these are the constraints that they work with in the United Nations. And now we have other aspects of digital diplomacy, citizen diplomacy, and journalistic diplomacy even, that can help actually, push out other messages.
Well, I mean, you mentioned citizen diplomacy there, so that's another kind of quite new phrase, I feel like. So can you sort of explain what that is? And, I think it's partly, I guess, social media sort of empowering citizens to act. People talk about the Arab Spring being a major moment for that. But Do you think that democratization of diplomacy will sort of change how things are done, on a global scale?
So citizen diplomacy is a wonderful rising tool and channel in order for the people to have their voice heard. Regarding the Arab Spring, which was really the first of what we saw as the democratization of social media accounts to gather people, gather protests and join together. And I was actually doing my master's here in Oxford at that time and watching that live, and I thought, this is it. Social media will be changing and is changing now. What we see as power structures, how we see citizens actually be able to challenge that power structure. Unfortunately, this is not what we saw with the result of the Arab Spring. We saw a lot of the downfall of a number of regimes, but a number of other, to use a diplomatic term, not so healthy regimes put in their place. But now what we're seeing as well with citizen diplomacy, and that's to do also with the evolution of phenomenal new tools, phenomenal new products, that if we look at the numerous conflicts, crises and war zones happening around the world as we speak, this is the first time, I would say, from 2023, that we are seeing citizen journalism actually live stream in real time what a war zone conflict is like. These citizens who are in conflict zones, and I'm using that as a diluted term here, but conflict zones where independent journalists are not being allowed in, they are the ones risking their lives. They are the ones broadcasting to the world in real time what is happening. And all that evidence collection, it's not just something to be watched, something to, what is the phrase? Kind of gore watching, if that is the correct phrase. But all of this is used for collection of actually possible trials, war crimes, the filming of war crimes. And it actually is a phenomenal development of the citizen diplomacy and the citizen diplomats. And the last point I'll say in this is that many of these citizen journalists who are doing the job of what we would have had as independent journalists who may not be allowed into crisis zones, they have now more power and reach. A number of them actually have more followers than President Biden himself.
Wow.
So that is the reach that they're getting. And as I always say to my students, well, why does this matter? Why should I care? Well, it matters because they are reaching their message, their aim, their experiences are reaching the masses of the world. And that influences policymakers.
That's what I was going to say. So they're putting information in the hands of people who can then lean on their own MPs, their own government, their own diplomats to try and change things at an international level.
Yeah. Despite seeing what I have just described and the power and the sheer reach and the quantity and the speed at which we are seeing these real-time crises played out, on the other hand, we have still the nexus of power in the Security Council. We have, despite millions, if not, dare I say, a billion, we have protests around the world in every capital. But that still has not translated into change, into the nexus of power of the Security Council. So what does that show us? Again, why does that matter? Why should we care? It shows us that even though citizen diplomacy, citizen journalism is at a rate and an expanse and a speed and a reach we've never seen before, gathering everyone around the world, it can still not change the voting procedure, the power of those main states. On an optimistic note, never has the world been able to actually see the power of the people, the extent that the people want something, are asking for something, are begging for something. And then you have 5 countries dictating no. So beforehand, this would not have been visual to the people of the world. So people are getting much more knowledgeable actually on how these systems are working and where the influence of power is.
But that's fascinating, that sort of disconnect between, you know, I think you're right, what people want and what's happening.
Yeah.
That's got to put pressure on traditional diplomacy at the very least. That's got to change the calculus of, you know, the elements that they're having to consider at the very least.
And certainly in smaller or medium-sized states, this has played a key role in crisis, in wartime, and we actually have seen, even particularly during election periods where leaders want to get re-elected and their entire country is calling for one policy change. We have seen huge policy change, but regarding those large power states who still control the UN security, their vote is the only thing which will make anything legally binding in law and for action within a crisis. It doesn't matter how the General Assembly, the conglomerate of the world states, vote. That is just a non-binding resolution. It matters what happens in this hall. But yes, for small and medium-sized states, that power of citizen diplomacy, that power of simply people taking to the streets due to the information they've received online, due to the real-time watching of what is happening, has led to great change with policy and foreign policy. So, you know, there's, as we say in diplomacy, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, I mean, speaking maybe of the ugly then, I mean, I guess the flip side of the sort of citizen journalism aspect is the rise of disinformation online and the weaponization of disinformation online.
Certainly.
There have been very credible accusations made at certain countries, by certain countries, of campaigns of disinformation to achieve foreign policy or domestic policy goals. So, you know, how do governments and diplomats deal with that kind of threat? How do they deal with disinformation?
So one thing to note about disinformation is that this is not a new phenomenon. As I say with everything in digital diplomacy, it is an evolution, not a revolution. So with disinformation, we have seen these campaigns from World War II, the Cold War, numerous other foreign policy crises and states. And now what we're seeing, of course, is what the global sphere deems as the key instigators of disinformation, China and Russia. There's clear, more than clear evidence to indicate that they very much are. But how do states combat this? Well, there's a number of ways states can combat this. The first is media literacy amongst populations. So what we're seeing, first of all, in, for example, Latvia, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they have been bombarded with Russian disinformation and also their alliance with NATO for numerous years, even pre the invasion of Ukraine. But what they have done is set up media literacy for their younger populations in order for them to identify and be able to see what is actual accurate information and what is disinformation.
With AI in particular, and with the sort of the speed of everything, do the tech giants have a role not just as sort of partners in diplomacy and partners in diplomacy efforts, but also in terms of trying to manage some of this, trying to control some of this disinformation?
Certainly. So one of the other key objectives for monitoring and altering disinformation campaigns is collaboration with tech companies to alter and make sure they're continuously monitoring in real time, taking out disinformation or misinformation that they have found, doing it often, doing it quickly, doing it through data analytics, machine learning. However, there is a flip side of this, more than a flip side, again, the good, the bad, the ugly, that we need to remember that the concept that I coined was the foreign policy of Silicon Valley. So you have these tech companies who have these CEOs, these leaders, they all have an agenda. They're all very much linked. This is not meant to sound conspiratorial at all. This is all database and data backed. They're all, very much linked with leaders of a number of nations. And what we're seeing now, and this is not just Silicon Valley, may I add, I'm talking Beijing. There's a number of different Silicon Valley points, we could say, around the world. But they are also very much in line with promoting the foreign policy objectives of that country. So when we see accounts being removed for disinformation, when in fact it is not disinformation, accounts being completely wiped of their information when this is not done. But most of the time this is done by AI fact checkers. And so they're looking for certain words and then your account gets removed for no reason. So we need to remember that these are not just objective bodies. These are not just objective institutions. They do have a foreign policy of some kind. So this is something to be highly aware of. And also we're seeing this, with China regarding TikTok. One interesting thing that, not many people might be aware of, but if you look at actually what they are promoting to quote unquote Western teenagers, for example, is on their For You page, it is all this kind of, to use the non-academic term, nonsense. All this thing to keep them on, the algorithm to keep them on, distracted and all of this. But if you analyze what is happening in China and happening in the East in a number of countries, if you look at their For You page, what the algorithm there is all about education, it's all about study, it's all about family. And this is not a coincidence, but all of this very much splits the countries, and it's also the developing of minds, the developing of futures. It's a very, very, I want to say subtle. It's not so subtle once you look at the data. It's quite obvious, but it is very, very detrimental.
Kind of cultural warfare.
Yeah, exactly. And it can be put under cultural diplomacy, so to speak. But it's very subversive, and so. Yeah, it's a key issue, and it's not disinformation, but it is, undermining. It can undermine social cohesion, make polarization even stronger in certain countries. And as we know with polarization, particularly since 2016, our inability to have conversations with people in the middle, you don't even have to come to the middle, but our inability to have conversations with people who disagree with us on any level I don't want to say has been completely removed, but it's a task and a half.
Because the shared set of facts is no longer agreed upon.
Yeah, exactly. And one quote that I actually always use, I'm a little obsessed with her, Hannah Arendt, is, in my opinion, one of the greatest political scholars of all time, who escaped Nazi Germany in World War II and came on to become one of the, as I said, greatest political scientists in the US, and covered the Eichmann tribunals as well. But one of her direct quotes that I always say, and bear in mind this was written in 1961, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced communist or the ardent Nazi, but the person for whom fact and fiction and truth and falsehood no longer exist. End quote. So I just think, for me, that is, encapsulates everything. It is not the extreme left, okay, yeah, we should have a bit of a worry of extreme left and extreme right, but the huge middle ground to disconcern with the disinformation, and also just the amount of information coming in, to disconcern between fact and fiction and truth and reality, is, in my opinion, one of the greatest threats to democratic processes, social cohesion, and our ability to function and speak to each other in any coherent level.
Yeah. Do you see any tools coming up that are going to fundamentally change the future of digital diplomacy? Is it going to be, virtual reality meetings? Is it going to be AI helping with that analysis process? Are there things that you see fundamentally changing what happens?
What we're calling now the fourth wave of technological evolution is artificial intelligence, which is, another key area of my study. And What's wonderful to see about this is, unlike the digital diplomacy wave, which was regarding ministries of foreign affairs, very, very slow to catch on, and I don't mean that in a critique. The same is with artificial intelligence. This is here, the wave is here. You need to learn, how to ride it and be successful at it. So we're seeing numerous tools with artificial intelligence. Just like digital diplomacy is not social media, AI is not just ChatGPT. So I think that's like one of my main things. I'm like, it's not just like the language processing model, but there are again, the dark side of AI, which if I could speak about for a moment. The first is bias and fairness. So we must remember with bias and fairness that AI is developed on large data sets of people simply inputting data that they have. And so whoever is putting in the data, whatever country is putting in the data, whatever country is developing these AI systems, be it ChatGPT, be it predictive analysis or climate change modeling, this is all related to the data that they have gathered and inputted. And that can be entirely skewed relating to other cultures and other states which do not have this data sets. The second is transparency and accountability. We do not know, particularly with, again, the tech giants, how this is being used. I've already mentioned there's a huge lack of regulation and accountability simply due to bureaucratic negotiations and the speed of AI. So we don't have that accountability. It goes back to who watches the watchers.
If you succeed in sort of interrogating those qualities that are considered good or necessary for diplomacy, and maybe, widening the number of qualities considered good, like bringing in intuition, that would seem like a good thing for a diplomat to have to me. So does that potentially lead then to better outcomes, just rethinking about what we look for in a diplomat?
In my opinion, I think in any serving diplomat's opinion, zeal, simply in intuition are phenomenal qualities to have as a diplomat. As I mentioned, my grandmother, who had joined the civil service, who's 93, and she got married at 22, and she got her pink slip, which she still has, and it says reason for leaving job, and there's just two boxes: new job or married. And she is one of the most intelligent women I've ever met, and she never worked again. And so yes, it could be viewed as a sad story, but also I want to make very clear when I say this, look at the progress that has been made. So I always think, although yes, we should critique and we should keep moving towards more inclusivity, more equality, more access for all people to the top promotional posts, but we shouldn't, just within that completely take out the breath of all the progress we have done. And we realize that a lot of people in the foreign ministry at the moment are there, perhaps ambassadors at this stage who were there at the time when this wasn't a thing. So that's not, giving people a free pass for discrimination. But we can be working towards equality and working towards promotion and working towards breaking down the barriers, but also recognizing the wonderful speed and change and opportunities that I am so grateful to be, have been born into that, and the people before me who made that possible.
So social media may be fast, but actually progress can be fast too,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
Okay, so we have two questions that we've been asking everybody. For anybody out there who doesn't know Lincoln, how would you describe the college in 3 words?
3 words. So I'm not known for keeping to my word count, but I'll try. I would describe it as community, forward thinking, hyphen, and life-changing, hyphen as well. So community, forward thinking, and life-changing.
So we're talking today, obviously, about the future. What advice would you give to young people today who are at Lincoln or thinking of coming to Lincoln, who are obviously going to be the stewards of that future?
The first is always have the ability and cultivate the ability to change your mind. You are coming into a wonderful university. Please do not stick to your preconceived notions and beliefs of the world, of society. Having the ability to change your mind, admitting you're wrong where the facts do not add up, in my opinion, is one of the greatest signs of intelligence. Keep your mind open and always be willing to change it. The second is, to use the kind of infamous phrase now, is in such a high-level university such as this, and a wonderful college such as Lincoln, is, don't waste your time on jealousy. Sometimes you're ahead, sometimes you're behind. The race is long, and at the end, it's only with yourself.
Well, that's a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.